June 22nd, 1941. The morning began like thousands of mornings before it. Across the western borders of the Soviet Union, soldiers stood at their positions, civilians went about their daily lives, and millions of people had no idea that one of the darkest chapters in human history was about to begin. At 4 a.m. the silence was broken. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire. German aircraft crossed the border. Millions of soldiers moved east. Operation Barbarossa had begun, the largest invasion in history. Nazi Germany had launched its attack on the Soviet Union. More than 3 million German and Axis troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, moved across a front stretching for thousands of kilometers. The Soviet Union was suddenly facing the full power of the German war machine. The first months were catastrophic. Entire armies were surrounded, airfields were destroyed, military communication collapsed, thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. German forces advanced rapidly toward major cities such as Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow. For many observers around the world, it seemed possible that the Soviet Union might collapse. But while battles raged on the Eastern Front, another important story was beginning thousands of kilometers away. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was watching the situation carefully. America had not yet officially entered the war against Germany. However, President Franklin Roosevelt understood that a German victory over the Soviet Union would dramatically change the balance of power in Europe. A Nazi-controlled continent would threaten the security of many nations around the world. Therefore, Washington began searching for ways to support countries fighting against Germany. Britain had already been resisting Germany for years. The Soviet Union had suddenly become one of the main battlefields of the war. In 1941, discussions began about providing military and economic assistance. The result was one of the largest supply programs in modern history. It was called Lend-Lease. The idea was simple. Countries fighting against the Axis powers could receive weapons, vehicles, raw materials, food and industrial equipment. The goal was not only to provide weapons, but to strengthen the entire war effort of the Allied nations. For the Soviet Union, this assistance became especially important because the first years of the war created enormous challenges. Millions of people were mobilized, factories had to be evacuated, entire industrial regions had to be moved away from the advancing German army. Thousands of factories were dismantled piece by piece, machines were loaded onto trains, workers and their families traveled east towards the Urals, Siberia and Central Asia. Some factories were rebuilt in open fields, others began production within weeks after relocation. The effort was extraordinary, but even with this industrial transformation there were shortages. The Soviet military needed enormous amounts of equipment, more trucks, more communication equipment, more fuel, more food, more industrial materials. This was where Allied assistance began to make an impact. However, delivering supplies was not easy. The most dangerous route was through the Arctic Ocean. From British and Icelandic ports, Allied ships traveled toward the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. These missions became known as the Arctic Convoys. Every journey was a battle. The ships faced freezing temperatures, enormous waves, German aircraft and enemy submarines. The Arctic environment itself was deadly. Ice covered the decks. Sailors worked for hours breaking frozen layers of ice to keep ships stable. A single torpedo strike could destroy an entire vessel carrying hundreds of tons of vital supplies. The convoys became symbols of courage and sacrifice. One of the darkest moments came in 1942 with convoy PQ-17. After a series of decisions forced the convoy to scatter, German submarines and aircraft attacked the isolated ships. Many transports were sunk, hundreds of sailors lost their lives. But despite the losses, the convoys continued. The Allied nations understood that stopping the flow of supplies could have serious consequences for the war effort. The United States and Canada also played major roles in expanding industrial production. American factories transformed into enormous production centers. Cars, aircraft, tanks, ships, weapons. Millions of items were produced on a scale never seen before. Canada also became an important part of the Allied industrial system. Canadian factories produced military equipment, vehicles, food supplies and other resources needed for the war. The contribution of these nations was not only measured by weapons. Industrial materials were equally important. Aluminium helped aircraft production. Copper supported electrical systems and communications. Railway equipment helped move armies, medical supplies saved lives, food shipments supported soldiers fighting thousands of kilometers away from home. Many of these items never appeared in dramatic battlefield photographs, but they became part of the enormous system that allowed the Allies to continue fighting. Meanwhile, the war continued to rage. In December 1941, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States officially entered World War II. America's industrial power was now fully committed to the conflict. Factories worked day and night, ships crossed oceans, aircraft filled the skies. The war became a global struggle between enormous alliances. At the same time, Allied aircraft began increasing bombing operations against German industrial targets. Factories, railway centers, fuel facilities, military infrastructure. These attacks forced Germany to spend valuable resources defending its territory and repairing damage. But on the Eastern Front, the situation remained desperate. The German army was approaching Moscow. Leningrad was surrounded. Millions of people were suffering. The outcome of the war was still uncertain. No one knew how long the conflict would last. No one knew how many more millions would die. But one thing was becoming clear. Germany was no longer fighting a single enemy. A growing alliance of nations was combining its armies, factories, resources, and determination. Every ship crossing the Arctic waters, every truck delivered to the front, every aircraft produced in a factory, every ton of food and material shipped across oceans. All of these became pieces of a much larger struggle, a struggle that would eventually decide the fate of the world. But before victory could come, the Allies would face their greatest tests. The next battlefield would become a symbol of destruction, endurance, and sacrifice. A city on the banks of the Volga River, Stalingrad. Summer 1942. After the failure of Germany's attempt to capture Moscow, the German command changed its strategy. Instead of launching another major attack toward the Soviet capital, Hitler ordered a massive offensive in the south. The goal was clear: capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, cut the Soviet Union's vital transportation routes, destroy the Red Army's ability to continue the war. The operation looked powerful on paper. German armies advanced through the vast territories of southern Russia. But war rarely follows the plan created in military headquarters. One city would soon become the center of the entire conflict, a city whose name would become known throughout the world: Stalingrad. Located on the western bank of the Volga River, Stalingrad was not only an important industrial center, but also a symbol. For Nazi Germany, capturing the city would be a major political victory. For the Soviet Union, defending it became a matter of survival. In August 1942, German aircraft launched massive bombing raids against the city. Entire neighborhoods disappeared under flames. Factories burned, buildings collapsed, the sky became dark with smoke. Thousands of civilians were killed or forced to flee. But the destruction created an unexpected battlefield. The city became a maze of ruins. Instead of open fields where German tanks could dominate, the Wehrmacht found itself trapped in brutal street fighting. Every building became a fortress, every basement became a defensive position, every street became a battlefield. The fighting was unlike anything seen before. Soldiers fought for individual rooms, for staircases, for abandoned factories. Sometimes opposing forces were separated by only a few meters. A building could change hands several times in a single day. The names of industrial sites such as the Red October factory, the Barricade factory, and the Tractor factory became symbols of resistance. While soldiers fought among the ruins, another battle was taking place far behind the front lines: the Battle of Supply. Modern wars are not won only by soldiers on the battlefield. They are also won by factories, railways, ships, and transportation systems. By 1942, Allied supplies were becoming increasingly important. Through the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet Union received large amounts of equipment and materials from the United States, Canada, and other Allied nations. Among the most valuable supplies were trucks. American-made vehicles such as Studebakers became famous among Soviet troops. They transported ammunition, moved artillery, carried fuel, evacuated wounded soldiers, moved troops quickly across enormous distances. The importance of transportation became especially clear during major offensives. An army could have thousands of tanks and guns, but without fuel, ammunition, and reliable transport, those weapons could not operate effectively. The Allies also provided many other important resources: communication equipment, industrial machinery, railway equipment, aircraft fuel, aluminium, copper, explosives, medical supplies, food products. Some supplies seemed simple but had enormous importance. Food, for example, helped support millions of soldiers. Industrial materials helped factories maintain production. Railway equipment helped move armies and supplies across a country larger than many continents. However, bringing these supplies to the Soviet Union remained extremely dangerous. The Arctic convoys continued their missions through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. German submarines hunted Allied ships, enemy aircraft attacked from the sky, storms and freezing temperatures threatened every vessel. The sailors who protected and operated these convoys knew that every mission could be their last, yet the ships continued moving, because the war effort depended on them. At the same time, the United States and Canada expanded their industrial production. American factories produced weapons and equipment at an incredible speed. The United States became what many historians later described as the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once produced civilian goods were transformed into military production centers. Cars became military trucks. Assembly lines produced aircraft. Shipyards launched vessels at record speed. Canada also played an important role. Its factories produced military vehicles, ammunition, food supplies, and other resources needed by the Allied nations. Together, these efforts created a massive industrial network supporting the war. But in Stalingrad, none of this changed the brutal reality for the soldiers fighting there. The battle continued month after month. The winter arrived. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. German troops who had expected a quick victory found themselves trapped in a destroyed city. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders were preparing a massive counterattack. The operation was called Operation Uranus. The plan was not to attack the strongest German positions inside the city. Instead, Soviet forces would strike the weaker Romanian and Italian units, protecting the German army's flanks. On November 19, 1942, the offensive began. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire. Soviet armies attacked from the north and south. The German forces were caught by surprise. Within days, the Soviet troops surrounded the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. Around 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped. For Germany, it was a disaster. Attempts were made to supply the surrounded army by air, but the amount of supplies delivered was far below what was needed. The soldiers inside the pocket faced starvation, freezing temperatures, and constant attacks. In January 1943, the situation became hopeless. On February 2, 1943, the remaining German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The victory became one of the greatest turning points of World War II. For the first time, a major German army had been completely destroyed. The myth of German invincibility was broken. But the victory came with an unimaginable cost. The city was almost completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed. Millions more were affected by the destruction surrounding them. The Battle of Stalingrad showed the world that Germany could be defeated. But it also revealed something else. Victory in such a massive war required more than courage on the battlefield. It required factories, transportation, resources, and cooperation between nations. The Soviet Union continued to produce enormous quantities of weapons and equipment. At the same time, Allied assistance continued to strengthen areas where supplies were urgently needed. The war was entering a new stage. Germany had suffered a devastating defeat, but it was far from surrendering. A new confrontation was approaching, a battle that would involve thousands of tanks and decide who would control the initiative on the Eastern Front. The location: Kursk. Spring 1943. The world was beginning to understand that the war had entered a new phase. The German defeat at Stalingrad was not just a military loss, it was a psychological shock that changed the way both sides viewed the conflict. For the first time, Nazi Germany had lost an entire major army. The Red Army had proven that the Wehrmacht could be stopped and defeated. But Germany was still extremely powerful. Its factories continued producing weapons, its commanders still had experienced officers. Its army remained one of the most dangerous fighting forces in the world. In Berlin, German leaders searched for a way to regain the initiative. They believed that one major victory could change the direction of the war. Their target was a large Soviet position that extended westward into German-controlled territory. It became known as the Kursk salient. The plan was called Operation Citadel. The German strategy was simple: attack from the north and south, encircle Soviet forces,
destroy a large part of the Red Army, restore German dominance on the Eastern Front. For this offensive, Germany prepared some of its most advanced weapons: new Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers, thousands of artillery pieces, elite armored divisions. German commanders believed these weapons would give them the advantage, but the Soviet Union had learned from previous battles. This time, the Red Army was not waiting unprepared. For months, Soviet engineers and soldiers built one of the strongest defensive systems of the entire war. Thousands of kilometers of trenches were constructed, millions of mines were placed, anti-tank positions were created, artillery units prepared hidden firing positions, reserve armies waited behind the front lines. The Soviet command knew that Germany would attack. The question was when. Meanwhile, behind the battlefield, another war was taking place, the war of production.
Factories across the Soviet Union continued operating at incredible speed. The industrial evacuation of 1941 had created one of the largest manufacturing efforts in history. Factories in the Urals and Siberia produced tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition. Workers often spent long hours inside factories under extremely difficult conditions. Many understood that every weapon produced could determine whether a soldier survived at the front. But even with this enormous industrial effort, Soviet production faced shortages in certain areas. This was where Allied assistance continued to play a significant role. Through the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet Union received materials and equipment from the United States, Canada, and other Allied nations. One of the most important contributions was transportation. American trucks became a crucial part of Soviet logistics. Vehicles such as the Studebaker US-6 helped move artillery, ammunition, fuel, and troops across enormous distances.
They allowed Soviet armies to become more mobile during large-scale offensives. Railway equipment was also important. As armies advanced, destroyed rail lines had to be repaired quickly. Locomotives, rails, and industrial equipment helped restore transportation networks. Other supplies included aluminum for aircraft production, copper for electrical systems, communication equipment, aviation fuel, medical supplies, food products, industrial machinery. These supplies did not fight battles by themselves, but they strengthened the overall ability of the Allies to continue the war. At the same time, the United States was expanding its own military operations. After entering the war in December 1941, American industry transformed into a massive war machine. Factories produced aircraft, ships, tanks, vehicles, and weapons on an unprecedented scale. The United States was not only building its own army, but also supplying many allied nations. Canada also increased production. Canadian factories produced vehicles, weapons, food supplies, and military equipment. Its contribution became an important part of the wider Allied effort. While this global industrial struggle continued, the battlefield of Kursk was preparing for the largest armored confrontation in history. On July 5, 1943, Germany launched Operation Citadel. The attack began with massive artillery strikes. German tanks moved forward through fields filled with mines. Aircraft from both sides filled the sky. The ground shook from explosions. But unlike previous German offensives, this time the Soviet defenses were ready. Every kilometer gained by German forces came at an enormous cost. The Wehrmacht advanced only slowly. Its powerful tanks faced prepared defenses, hidden anti-tank guns, and determined Soviet resistance. One of the most famous clashes occurred near the village of Prokhorovka. Hundreds of tanks from both sides became involved in fierce combat.
For decades, this battle became one of the most famous examples of the brutal armored warfare of World War II. Modern historians continue to study the exact details of the engagement, but its importance as part of a larger Kursk campaign remains undeniable. The German offensive was losing momentum, and then came another major event. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The invasion forced Germany to move resources and attention toward the Mediterranean. The German leadership now faced a growing problem. The war was expanding. More fronts, more enemies, more pressure. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces launched their own counteroffensives. They liberated the cities of Arel and Belgorod. Then they moved toward Kharkiv. The strategic initiative was shifting. Germany was no longer dictating the direction of the war, the Allies' war. But the pressure on Germany was not only coming from the battlefield. The skies above Europe had become another front. British and American bombers increasingly attacked German industrial centers. Their targets included aircraft factories, oil facilities, railway networks, military production centers. These bombing campaigns did not completely destroy German industry, but they forced Germany to spend enormous resources defending its territory. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns had to be deployed. Aircraft production had to focus increasingly on defensive fighters. Factories had to repair damage instead of producing only weapons for the front. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Atlantic was also changing. For years, German submarines had threatened Allied supply lines. They attempted to cut the flow of resources across the oceans. But by 1943, Allied technology and tactics improved. Better radar, more escort ships, long-range aircraft, improved coordination. Slowly, the balance shifted. The Allies were becoming more capable of protecting their supply routes.
This meant that more equipment, fuel and materials could reach the battlefields. By the end of 1943, the situation was dramatically different from 2 years earlier. Germany had failed to defeat the Soviet Union, the Allies were increasing their strength, the Soviet army was advancing west, American and British forces were preparing for a massive operation in Western Europe. But opening a second front was not a simple decision. It required enormous planning, millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, a huge amount of equipment. The next great operation would become one of the most famous military actions in history. Its name, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy.
Spring 1944. The war had entered a completely new stage. Nearly 3 years had passed since Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. During that time, the Eastern Front had become the largest and bloodiest battlefield in human history. Millions of Soviet soldiers had fought and died in battles from Moscow to Stalingrad and Kursk. But now Germany faced a new reality. It was no longer fighting on only one major front. The pressure was coming from multiple directions. In the east, the Red Army was preparing massive offensives. In the west, the Allies were preparing an operation that would change the future of Europe forever. The operation was called Overlord. The goal was simple but incredibly difficult. Create a permanent Allied foothold in Western Europe. Liberate occupied countries. Force Germany to fight a major war on 2 land fronts. But preparing such an operation required enormous resources. The Allies needed thousands of ships, millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of aircraft, fuel, weapons, medical equipment, engineering materials. Everything had to be organized perfectly. Across southern England, a massive military build-up was taking place. American, British, Canadian and other Allied forces gathered for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Military camps appeared everywhere. Roads were filled with convoys of trucks. Ports worked day and night. Factories produced equipment without stopping. The scale of preparation was almost impossible to imagine. The United States played a major role in this build-up. American industry had become one of the greatest production systems in history. Factories produced aircraft, vehicles, weapons and ships at enormous speed. American soldiers arrived in Europe with huge amounts of equipment. Canada also made a significant contribution. Canadian forces prepared for combat operations, while Canadian industries produced military supplies and supported the wider Allied war effort. Britain became the main base for the invasion. For years, the country had resisted Germany and now became the launch point for the liberation of Europe. But Germany was not unaware of the danger. The Atlantic coast of France had been heavily fortified. The Germans created the Atlantic Wall, a massive defensive system of bunkers, artillery positions and obstacles along the coastline. German commanders expected the Allies to attack somewhere in northern France. The question was where. The Allies launched one of the largest deception operations of the entire war. The goal was to convince Germany that the main invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Fake military camps were created, inflatable tanks were placed near the coast, false radio messages were transmitted. The Allies even created fictional armies to mislead German intelligence. The deception worked. Many German commanders remained convinced that Normandy would only be a secondary attack. Then came the morning of June 6, 1944, a date that would become known around the world, D-Day. Before sunrise, thousands of Allied aircraft crossed the English Channel. Bombers attacked German positions. Paratroopers landed behind enemy lines. Then came the naval invasion. A massive fleet moved toward the beaches of Normandy. More than 5,000 ships participated. Thousands of aircraft provided support. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers prepared to enter France. The invasion took place across 5 main beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. American forces landed at Utah and Omaha. British forces landed at Gold and Sword. Canadian forces landed at Juno. The fighting was brutal. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced especially strong resistance. German defenses opened fire as landing boats approached. Many soldiers were killed before reaching the shore, but despite heavy losses, the Allies continued moving forward. By the end of the day, they had established several important positions along the coast. The invasion was a success. The Western Front had been reopened. Germany now faced a nightmare scenario. It had to defend against a massive Allied army in France, while continuing to fight the Soviet Union in the east. The pressure was becoming overwhelming. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union launched one of the largest offensives of the entire war. In June 1944, the Red Army began Operation Bagration. Its goal was the destruction of German forces in Belarus. The operation was devastating for Germany. The Soviet advance was extremely successful. German forces suffered enormous losses. Cities such as Minsk were liberated. The Eastern Front moved rapidly westward. The two Allied offensives created a situation Germany had desperately tried to avoid: a war on two major European fronts. As the Allies advanced, logistics became more important than ever. Armies moving hundreds of kilometers required constant supplies: fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment, transportation. The Soviet Union continued producing huge quantities of weapons. At the same time, Allied Lend-Lease deliveries continued. American trucks helped Soviet armies transport supplies during major offensives. Railway equipment helped repair damaged infrastructure. Communication equipment improved coordination. Industrial materials supported production. The Allied war effort was not based on one single factor. It was a combination of soldiers fighting on the front lines, workers producing equipment in factories, sailors protecting supply routes, and civilians supporting the war effort. By late 1944, Germany was losing territory everywhere. France had been liberated.
Belgium and Luxembourg were freed. The Soviet army was approaching Germany's borders. The German economy was collapsing under the pressure of constant war, but Nazi Germany refused to surrender. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. At first, the attack surprised Allied forces. German troops pushed through the Ardennes forests, but the offensive eventually lost momentum. The Allies recovered and pushed German forces back. For Germany, this was the final major attempt to change the outcome of the war. By the beginning of 1945, the result was becoming clear. The Third Reich was surrounded. The end was approaching. In the east, Soviet armies were preparing for the final assault on Berlin. In the west, Allied forces were crossing into Germany. The war that had destroyed much of Europe was entering its final chapter. But the final battle would be the most symbolic of all. The target, Berlin. January 1945. Europe was exhausted. Almost 6 years of war had transformed the continent into a landscape of destruction. Cities that had existed for centuries were reduced to ruins. Factories had been destroyed. Millions of people had lost their homes. Families across Europe had been separated by battle, occupation, and death. But after years of fighting, the end was finally approaching. Germany was surrounded. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was preparing its final offensive. In the West, American, British, Canadian and other Allied forces were advancing through Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing. But the final months of the war would still be extremely violent. The Soviet Union launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. It was one of the largest military operations of the Eastern Front. Millions of Soviet soldiers moved westward. German defenses collapsed in many areas. Within weeks, Soviet forces reached the Oder River, only a short distance from Berlin.
The German capital was now directly threatened. At the same time, Allied armies in the West crossed into Germany. The forces that had landed in Normandy months earlier were now moving toward the heart of the Nazi state. Germany faced an impossible situation. It had to defend against powerful armies approaching from two directions. Its industrial system was damaged, its fuel supplies were running out, its military reserves were disappearing. The bombing campaigns carried out by Allied aircraft had placed enormous pressure on German infrastructure. Factories producing aircraft and weapons were repeatedly attacked. Railways, bridges and fuel facilities became major targets. Germany was forced to spend huge resources trying to protect and repair its damaged economy. Meanwhile, the Allied supply system continued to function. The ability to move enormous quantities of equipment, food, fuel and ammunition became one of the defining advantages of the coalition.
The United States continued producing massive amounts of military equipment. American factories created thousands of vehicles, aircraft, ships and weapons. Canada continued supporting the Allied war effort through production, military service and supplying important resources. Britain continued serving as a key base for operations in Europe. The Soviet Union continued its own enormous military production while carrying out some of the largest offensives of the war. Together, these efforts created a level of military and industrial power that Germany could no longer match. In April 1945, the final battle began, the Battle of Berlin. The Soviet army approached the city from the east. The fighting was intense. German forces defended streets, buildings and government districts. Every neighborhood became a battlefield. The city was surrounded by destruction. Civilians hid in underground shelters. Soldiers fought among burning buildings. The final days of the Nazi regime had arrived.
On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in his underground bunker in Berlin. The leadership of Nazi Germany collapsed. On May 2nd, 1945, Berlin surrendered. But the war in Europe was not officially over yet. Representatives of Germany signed the unconditional surrender documents. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day was declared. Across the Allied nations, millions celebrated. In London, Washington, Moscow, Paris, cities filled with crowds celebrating the end of the war. But behind the celebrations was the memory of unimaginable suffering. The Second World War had taken the lives of tens of millions of people. The Soviet Union suffered enormous losses. Millions of soldiers and civilians died during the German invasion and occupation. Entire regions were destroyed. The United States lost hundreds of thousands of service members. American soldiers fought across Europe, the Pacific and other theaters of war. Canada also paid a heavy price.
Canadian soldiers participated in major operations, including the liberation of Western Europe. Thousands never returned home. Britain endured years of bombing, shortages and sacrifice. France and many other occupied nations suffered under German occupation and fought for liberation. The victory over Nazi Germany was not the achievement of one country alone, it was the result of a massive coalition. Each nation contributed in different ways. The Soviet Union carried the main burden of the land war against Germany in the East and paid an extraordinary human cost. The United States provided enormous industrial power, producing weapons, vehicles, ships and supplies, while fighting on multiple fronts. Canada, Britain and other allied countries contributed soldiers, resources, technology and industrial support. The Lend-Lease program became one important part of this wider allied effort. It provided the Soviet Union and other allies with equipment and materials that helped strengthen their ability to continue fighting. Historians continue to discuss the exact scale and importance of different contributions, but there is broad agreement that the defeat of Nazi Germany resulted from many combined factors. Military resistance, industrial production, strategic decisions, economic strength, international cooperation, and the sacrifices of millions of people. The story of World War II is not only a story of battles and generals, it is also the story of factory workers building machines, sailors crossing dangerous oceans, doctors saving wounded soldiers, farmers producing food, engineers creating new technologies, and ordinary people surviving one of the darkest periods in human history. Victory came in 1945, but the world that emerged from the war was completely different. Europe had been transformed, new international organizations were created.
The United States and the Soviet Union became the two dominant global powers. The war against Nazi Germany had ended, but a new era of tension was beginning, the Cold War. Yet the memory of World War II remained a reminder of one important lesson. When nations face a common threat, cooperation and unity can change the course of history. The victory of 1945 was built by millions of people from many countries. Their sacrifices shaped the world that exists today.